Hello students, Mr. Mind here, and it is Thursday, April 30th, and today I'm just going to kind of get you started. We're going to review the work from Monday and Tuesday and kind of talk about the work today and also just go over some general updates. So first things first, today's work, you have today and tomorrow to do it. It is due by 8 a.m. Saturday, so you have till 8 a.m. Saturday to get it done. It is a Google form, obviously, as you know, as you're on it. So please note that it will take a little bit longer and it won't save your progress. So whatever you do, please make sure that you do it all in one sitting. And it'll be a little bit longer, so make sure you take your time on it, okay? The next Canvas conference will be live tomorrow, Friday, 11:30 a.m. So make sure you keep that in your minds. If you want to come for help, ask questions, or if you just want to chat, that's fine too. Probably next Tuesdays we'll do another quizzes live because I think we're gonna do a quiz next week at the end of the week. So be prepared for that. Skyward is being updated with assignments. It'll show if you completed them or not. I'm still taking the grades on things just in case they let me start putting in grades officially. So I know it shows, if you look at Skyward, it'll show check marks, but I actually have the grades behind those. So at any moment I could release the grades. I'm just not supposed to yet. So with that being said, if you have any missing assignments, you can go back and complete them. Just email me once you have and tell me which assignment you completed so I can update it. 'Cause sometimes kids email me and say, I completed the assignment, but I'm not sure which one. So please just let me know which assignment you completed and emailed, because you can technically complete any of them at any time. Okay? So, with that being said, today let's look at and review the work from Tuesday. So first of all, your notes. I will eventually have you check in your notes, okay? Not yet. So I appreciate some people have emailed me, which is fine, and I'll take that, but don't worry about sending the notes in yet. I'm trying to work up a good way for you to show me your notes. But with that being said, okay, you had stations. So you had stations A, B, C, D, and we're going to go through them real quick. So station A was a secondary source, okay, about life being a slave. So a couple things. Station A, who created or wrote this document? There was no author, so I got this from an online textbook. There was no straight-up author. This Station A, The Life of a Slave, was also a secondary source, so this was not a primary source. It wasn't written by somebody that was from the time of slavery. Who were slave drivers? What did they do? Slave drivers were actually slaves themselves. So this wasn't super common, but it did happen where some slaves would earn the trust of their masters or overseers, and they could possibly be kind of made into like a manager of sorts, I guess you could say, and they would drive the slaves themselves. They would work the slaves themselves, and they would get better privileges, better food, and better situations. So slave drivers were slaves, but they were still slaves, and they could still be mistreated and punished just as bad, but they had a little bit more power and a little bit more freedom, and they worked the slaves under them. So that did happen, but it wasn't very common, but it did happen. Generally, overseers were the ones working the slaves, and they were generally white, but slave drivers could happen sometimes. Life on a farm plantation for a field slave. Field slaves had it the hardest. They would literally work from the moment the sun came up to the moment the sun went down. And then after that, they would have to work their own little farms. So field slaves had their own little farms for food, for their own food. So they would have to work really long hours. Obviously, this was mostly in the summertime and spring and fall. During the winter, actually, slaves kind of had a fair amount of time off. They still had to do some work here and there, but at least when the growing season was over, they had a little bit more time than themselves. But they worked terrible conditions. They would work in the heat. They would get few breaks. You know, their overseers were constantly watching them and could mistreat them, punish them, whip them, do other terrible things. They led hard lives. Field slaves did not live long either because of their hard lives. It's been shown that on average, field slaves lived very much shorter lives than most other people in America during this time period. So they lived very hard lives. Now, a household slave would live in the house with the master's family. They would generally live in a room in the basement, generally, or they would have a special room on the main floor, but it would be like a small room, almost like a closet. So they didn't have it super great. But what made life tough for a household slave was they were kind of prisoners in a lot of ways, right? Like, so a household slave wouldn't get a chance to see their family and their community as much because they were constantly living in the household with the slave master's family. They were doing all the chores, cooking, and cleaning. Household slaves were generally treated better. Mostly for the reason was if a master mistreated his household slave, there's a good chance that he could, the household slave could mess with the cooking, poison the cooking. The household slaves would sometimes look after the kids. So generally household slaves were treated better, sometimes even like family. Sometimes they were even treated well, I would even say. But they were still prisoners. They still had no freedom. They couldn't make any of their own choices, and they were still working for no wage. So I mean, it's still terrible in a lot of ways, but it was definitely a better situation than a field slave. Household slaves definitely had a little better. Generally, household slaves were more women, but there were men household slaves too. Sometimes men household slaves would help take care of the livestock, the animals, the horses and stuff, or do other chores, but generally they were women. All right, so Station B was a slave auction. So this image, if you look, has a lot of details for it, okay? I mean, obviously the terrible thing is you have a family up here, right? And like I said, one of the worst situations was that at slave auctions, families could be separated. So there's a strong possibility that could happen. Sometimes they'd be bought together, sometimes they would not, but it just showed how basically these human beings here up on stage are being treated like property, like animals, and it just shows how terrible it is. And you see people auctioning them, investigating them. It's just completely messed up. So there's a lot of details here. There's a sign here that shows the auction, time, all that stuff. On the bottom here, there's a paper kind of showing all the stats. You know, right now my Google Slides is blocking it. There's a paper down here showing the stats and maybe the information of the slaves. You have the auctioneer up here bidding. So pretty terrible. People talking about prices probably. And this is actually from New Orleans. Is a painting from New Orleans. So there's a lot of details you could have described here. Okay, but they're not being treated as humans, being treated as property is the main thing I want you to see, which is terrible. Now this Station C was the experiences of a slave, and it was written by Lunsford Lane in 1842. So this was a slave. He eventually escaped, but he wrote his experiences as being a child in slavery, and it kind of wrote some interesting things. So Lunsford Lane was a slave, eventually got his freedom, learned how to read and write, and he wrote his experiences of being a slave as a child, and it's kind of interesting. So who wrote this document? It was created by Lunsford Lane. He's the author. It is a primary source, so he actually wrote this. This is from 1842. What were slave children scared of? So if you look, the slave children feared the most of being split up from their families. So like I said, one of the biggest punishments a slave could receive is being sold, or one of their family members being sold, or one of their friends being sold, because they would never see them again. If they were sold to a different plantation or something like that, that was it. There was no seeing them again. You couldn't necessarily go out and sneak out and go visit them. So they feared being sold the most. Especially children feared this because, you know, children obviously depend on their families and their community. So children feared this greatly. It was a big fear all the time. It could always possibly happen. So it was a terrible thing to hold over children. Number 10, in the beginning, were slave children treated different than white children? Generally, no, at least from Lunsford Lane's account. So if you look at Lunsford Lane's account, he talks about how, yeah, they kind of just played around. They did little chores here and there, but other than that, they were kind of, there was no big difference. So you can see, I did not perceive a difference between us. I had no brothers and sisters, but they were other kind of families. Children play in the same yard with me and my mother, so they would play. They were doing essentially labors. They were just playing around, hanging out. Colored and white. So we look here in the second paragraph. So it's kind of interesting. They did sometime even, yeah, the kids would play together. I mean, sometimes this didn't happen all the time. It depended on the master, but in this situation, they were allowed to play together and hang out. Now, once they got a little bit older, the difference came in. White children were allowed to go to school and they learned training. Sorry, I got cut off here. While the black children were forced into their slavery and into their bondage. So they were started to work and be treated badly, possibly, and they lost all their freedoms. So as soon as they turned around the age of 12, kind of the age you guys are, that's when the shift started to happen, where they weren't being treated like children anymore. They would be treated like wherever they were going to be. So master children would probably go off to school, learn their schooling, and unfortunately, the African-American children would be forced into their slavery. So just shows how, as children at least, they were somewhat treated better and equal, but that did change, unfortunately. But it's kind of interesting to see that. So this was a map of slavery in the United States. So right after the Revolutionary War. So this happens right after the Revolutionary War ends. We could see, once the United States is established, that the amount of slaves. So a couple things. Which state had the most slaves? Virginia was by far one of the biggest slaveholding states, which makes sense because Jamestown's Virginia, and that's where slavery started. So the state that started it had the most. So Virginia has the most slaves by far. Which state had 100 slaves in 1790? So it shows New Hampshire. New Hampshire up here in the top had very few slaves. So like I said, the North had very few slaves overall, and eventually they got rid of them pretty quickly. Which state had 100,000 slaves in 1790? That would be North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, all had at least 100,000 slaves in 1790. New York, how many slaves did New York have? New York did have slavery, so not for a long time. They got rid of it pretty quickly once again compared to the southern states, but they did have 25,000 slaves, and mostly in southern New York, but they did have them. Why the southern states have the most slaves? We talked about this. Southern states had good conditions for farming, large plantations, a lot of land that being worked, and not enough people to work it. So they started bringing in slaves that could handle the weather, handle the work, and handle the conditions. And that's why southern slaves were there the most. So that was just kind of a review of slavery. Okay, you're going to see a little bit more review of slavery in today's work. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit is slaves fought back, and we kind of talked about this. And today you're going to read more about it and watch a video about it. Slaves fought back quite a bit too, and this was something that slave owners didn't want to share because they didn't want the idea of slaves fighting back sharing. But it shows, I know this map's kind of hard to see, how many slave revolts happened over the 300 years of slavery. If you look, Virginia had 84 slave revolts, and that's kind of hard to see. North Carolina had 17. South Carolina had 42. By slave revolts or slave rebellions or slave insurrections, as they're called here, which is the same thing, we mean slaves getting together, getting weapons, and fighting back. Now, fighting back is in literally killing their masters and then running away. Literally sometimes, like as you'll see in the case of Nat Turner, gathering weapons and basically forming a small army and starting to free more and more slaves until the states would send in their militia or their armies to stop them. There was lots of these slave revolts. So if you look, there were literally hundreds of slave revolts over time. Louisiana had 42, and this would involve hundreds of slaves to dozens of slaves, just depending on how big it got, but it did happen. So slaves fought back, because people ask, like, well, why didn't the slaves just take slavery as it was? Well, no, they did fight back. Now, the slaves, when they did fight back, they had a couple giant disadvantages. This is why when slave revolts did happen, they weren't super successful. One, the slaves, got to remember, generally weren't educated, so they couldn't read or write and send messages to each other, which is a big disadvantage when you're trying to organize a slave revolt. Two, they didn't know how to use weapons, so it's not like slaves knew how to use muskets, right? But weapons back then weren't like they are today. You needed to train on how to use them. You needed to know how to load them, use them, fire quickly. Slaves generally didn't have that because they'd never had a chance to. So they couldn't fight back generally with their muskets because they just didn't have skills. Which is why slaves usually used weapons like swords, knives, daggers, and stuff. But still, that's not as good as having a musket or a firearm. So they did definitely struggle with that, and that's generally why the slave revolts, when they did start, they kind of ended quickly because they couldn't keep fighting because they didn't have the skills and the means. Also, when a slave revolt did happen, the masters would band together to get literally get the army out to sometimes stop them. So the slaves rarely stood a chance. But sometimes slave revolts did succeed in the sense that those slaves were managed to escape. They would go up north to the free states, or they would go out west, or they would just go into hiding, and they would kind of keep their freedom that way. But sometimes they did somewhat succeed, but generally they were put down, unfortunately. Now the famous slave revolt, the most famous one, happened in the mid-1800s, is Nat Turner's slave revolt. You're going to watch a video about this later. He's kind of an interesting guy. He has an interesting background. This is a portrait of Nat Turner being captured after his insurrection. So he was eventually captured and executed for his slave revolt, but it did last a while, and his slave revolt kind of started showing more people how bad slavery was, because him and his slaves, when they revolted, they committed a lot of violence, but they committed a lot of violence because they had been treated so poorly. And this kind of made people start to realize, it started the debate in the United States of, is slavery worth it? Is it worth having? And we'll talk more about this in the coming weeks and how parts of the country, especially the North, hated slavery. They thought it wasn't worth it. The South still wanted to keep it and liked it. But Nat Turner kind of opens that question up a little bit more. So you'll learn more about him. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to go through the Google form, answer all the questions. Most of the questions you'll get back at the end, but some of them I have to hand grade, so some of them you'll have to wait on. When you are done, make sure you submit. This will take a little bit longer. Make sure you read, watch all the videos, okay? If you have any questions, always feel free to email me or contact me, okay? If you even want to talk one-on-one, that can always be arranged, okay? So, good luck, and like I said, it's due Saturday.